Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the Anbernic RG Slide. So this is a slide-up handheld, kind of looks like a PSP GO, but a lot bigger. Now I've only had it for a few hours, so today we're going to do an impressions video. I'm going to talk about things like the ergonomics and the button feel and the size, as well as the screen and the audio, those things that I can figure out in that first day. And then in about a week, I'm going to do my final review where I'll talk about whether or not I think it's worth it, and we'll also do a deep dive in terms of performance and other things I find along the way. And right off the bat, I can say this is a very unique handheld, but I'm not really sure if it's going to be for everybody. I think there's a lot of nostalgia involved in this form factor, and a lot of other concessions that you have to think about when you have something this shape and size. Either way, I think we're going to have some fun picking this thing apart, so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Now, going over the specs here, the CPU is the Unisoc T820. And this chip has been used in a lot of Anbernic handhelds previously. It was kind of their premier chip last year. So it's going to have the same performance as devices like the RG556, the RG Cube, the RG406H, and the RG406V. Like with those other devices, this one also has 8 GB of RAM and 128 gigs of internal storage, as well as a micro SD card slot if you want to expand that. Now the display here is brand new. It's using a technology called LTPS, which is different than IPS and TFT. These types of displays are known for having fast response times as well as high pixel density, and they're found in a lot of more modern smartphones. The display itself is 4.7 inches with a 4:3 aspect ratio and a resolution of 1280 by 960. This is also the first Anbernic device I've seen with a 120 Hz refresh rate, which has a lot of implications when it comes to emulation, being able to use things like black frame insertion, but then also it helps to reduce input latency. The battery here is pretty standard for a handheld this size. It's 5,000 milliamp hours, and they say on the spec sheet it should give us about 6 hours of battery life. It is also a heavy handheld, 380 grams or about 13.5 ounces. As far as connectivity, we've got 2.4 and 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 5.0. The USB-C port can also give video out, but it's a little bit wonky with the T820. So essentially it can either charge or it can give video out, but when you plug it into a USB hub, it often has problems. And I tested it with this device just a few minutes ago. It had those same problems. So it does have video out, but you can't really consoleize it because you can't charge it at the same time. As far as operating system, we're looking at Android 13, and this one is also unique in that it has capacitive joysticks, which we saw in their previous model, the RG557. Okay, let's start with an unboxing, and this was sent over from Anbernic for review, but like with all my videos, all opinions are my own, no money was exchanged in any way, and they're not going to see this video ahead of time. The box is a little bit different than other Anbernic boxes. It actually has a slide-out cover, which is kind of apropos given the title of the actual device. Inside, we are going to have a little envelope, and inside this, we will have the screen protector, and then also we're going to have a quick instruction manual, very similar to what we've seen previously from this company. Further inside, we've got our USB-C to USB-A charging cable, and then the device itself. And so we can just pull this guy out, and first impression here, man, this thing is a lot bigger than you may expect. Even looking at this footage, you might be thinking, no, it's actually pretty small, but no, this is a very chunky handheld. Look at how thick this is. In fact, before we go any further, I think the next thing we need to do is talk about its size and weight. I think the easiest parallel will be the Sony PSP GO. This has always been kind of celebrated as being, a really small handheld and just kind of amazing in terms of engineering and whatnot. And it has a very similar mechanism to what we're reviewing today, but a much smaller size. You can see here that it's just kind of dwarfed by the Anbernic RG Slide. And it's real striking difference when you look at the thickness here. It's almost like the RG Slide ate a couple Sony PSPs for lunch. Something like the PSP GO kind of feels like an everyday carry little thing, like you can just throw it in your pocket with your phone and you'll still have something to play games on. Meanwhile, the RG Slide is just so big that I wouldn't really recommend it in that regard. Here's a size comparison between my iPhone 15 Pro non-max version versus this one here, and you can see that, man, there's just a huge difference, especially when you get to the thickness part. It is pretty crazy how big and chunky this is. I don't know if it was just because of the mechanism, but I just figured that this would be, kind of like a PSP GO. But no, this thing is in a category of its own. Now, the thing about the RG Slide is that it gives me late 90s and early 2000 vibes, so I'm going to try to compare it against similar handhelds from that era just because I think it's kind of fitting. So for example here, the original Nintendo DS, you can see that they're actually very close in size. Among all the handhelds that I own, this one seems to be the closest parallel, and this is also a very chunky boy. I don't know if you've held a Nintendo DS recently, but man, these things are really big compared to more modern handhelds. But you can see that it is actually very similar to the RG Slide in terms of overall size. So if you happen to have an old Nintendo DS laying around, go dig it out of your closet and you'll see exactly what you can expect here. Now, if you've got a Nintendo DS Lite, here's the size comparison between these two, and again, the RG Slide kind of dwarfs it. I also have a new Nintendo 2DS XL here, and you can see it's a little bit wider, but again, not quite as thick as the RG Slide, which is, yeah, a really chunky boy. So yeah, there's a big difference here as well. If we look at an old school GBA, you can see that, yeah, this one is a little bit less wide, but then also about the same thickness, maybe a little bit less thick. And then finally, a couple Sony comparisons. So here's an old school PSP, which you can see is wider, but not quite as tall. And then my 2000 series PS Vita, which is wider, but a lot thinner as well. That's probably one of the greater things about this second series of PS Vitas. It's really thin. Now, if you're looking for a comparison with similar handhelds, here is the Anbernic RG 406H, which has the same chipset as the RG Slide. Now, this one has a smaller screen. It's only 4 inches, but you can see it's a wider handheld in general, just because it has the controls and the screen all in one candy bar shape. This one is also about the same thickness, but it's because it has these thick grips on each side. And so, yes, overall, when laying it flat on a table, it's about the same height, but otherwise, yeah, it's kind of a different shape and size. Here's another Anbernic handheld, the RG557. This one is a recent release and has a more upgraded processor, but is quite expensive, about $250. But the analog sticks on this are actually the same as in the RG Slide. So these are actually the same between the two. This one is quite a bit wider. It's got a 16:9 display, but it has about the same thickness. So they're about the same here because of the ergonomic grips on this one as well. Now, moving on to other companies, here's the Retroid Pocket 5. This one is a little bit more powerful than what we'll find in this one, but it also has a 16:9 display, which makes it wider. This one is not quite as thick as the Anbernic just because the ergonomic grips do not stick out as much. And then another handheld from Retroid that's a very similar size is the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. This one is about the same thickness as well, as you can see here, but it is a little bit differently shaped just because these triggers right here do protrude. But I think in just terms of like overall size and throwing it in your bag, it's very similar between these two, other than the fact that this one doesn't actually cover the screen and protect it, whereas this one does. And so this one, obviously is a clamshell, so you have the screen here, you protect it when you close it, whereas this one you protect the controls, but you don't protect the screen. But we also do have that screen protector, which comes with the device, and it is a perfect fit right here with the glass portion of the display, and it actually form fits perfectly, so you can just kind of drop it in easily. So it's obviously not going to be as protected as with like a clamshell handheld, but still, this gives me a little bit of peace of mind. So long story short, it is a big handheld. It's nothing compared to like a Steam Deck, but still, man, this is a lot bigger than I thought it would be. And so that's my first surprise when holding this handheld, is that it's a lot bigger than I expected. I thought it would be an everyday carry type of thing, but no, it's just way too big. It slides into the pocket very easily, which is nice, but it's also just very bulky as well as heavy. Speaking of which, let's talk about the weight. So this one here is 377 grams. I think on the specs sheet it says 380. And that is very heavy for a retro style handheld. To give you an idea, it's about 30 grams heavier than the RG557. And even though it's about the size of the RG Flip, it's about 70 grams heavier than that. In fact, every handheld that I have in my collection that's of a similar size to the RG Slide is just a lot lighter by comparison. In order to find a device of similar weight or heavier, you have to get a much bigger handheld, something like the Odin 2 Portal. And one of the big contributors to this weight is the fact that this back portion right here on the top is actually made out of metal, and you can feel that it's just a lot heavier than the bottom portion. When you combine that with the glass that's all across the front here, yes, this is a very top-heavy device just because this portion is so much heavier than the bottom portion here. So now let's actually go around the device and talk about all the different components and how they feel and everything else. Let's start with all the things that we can see before we actually slide up the handheld. So number one, we've got our stereo slits right here. So this is for the speakers. And then we have these two buttons. So this button functions as our back and home button. If we tap it once, it'll be back in the Android menu, or if we press and hold it, it'll function as home. This one on the right is a function button. If you press and hold it, it'll actually bring up the Retroid launcher, which is their own front end. We can also leave the front end by doing the same thing, pressing and holding to get back into Android. Up top, we have shoulder and trigger buttons that are in line, much like older Anbernic devices, and also the trigger buttons are taller than the shoulder buttons, which allows you to kind of feel where each one is. The buttons are easy to press down on, but they are micro switches, so they're a little bit clicky, kind of like little mouse clicks. On the bottom, we've got our headphone jack and LED charging indicator, then our USB-C port, which is capable of video out, but not when charging at the same time. On the left, we've got our micro SD card slot, and then on the right side, we have our volume up and down, and then our power and sleep button. On the back, we've got our active cooling thermals. So this is going to be our intake right here, so the air will come in here, and then surprisingly, it actually blows out the bottom as opposed to the top on most other handhelds. Now, opening it up is as simple as just kind of flicking it up like that, and it doesn't take a lot of force. Basically, as soon as you get to like around there, it just kind of goes on its own. It's a little bit forceful, and it's also loud. Like, it's surprisingly loud. It's almost comical. Now, you can open it up quietly if you just kind of hold it as you slide it, but it's still a pretty loud device when you do this. The mechanism underneath is a full-on metal plate, so it feels very secure when you're doing it. I feel like I could probably do this for a while. However, it is worth noting that, with other devices that have the same mechanism, like the PSP GO or those Sony Xperia Play devices, some of them would have their ribbon cables actually rip over time. And so it's not a super common thing, but something to look out for is the fact that, if even Sony had problems with the hardware, then, someone like Anbernic with their first time making a device, that might be something to look out for in the future. So as it stands, I like this sliding mechanism. It's just really loud, but very satisfying. And so, yeah, I've been enjoying just messing around with this. And if we go into settings, there's an option to change out the behaviors of when you slide it. So right now I have it set to when I slide it up, it's going to wake up the device. When I slide it down, it's going to put it into what they say hibernation, but it's just really sleep. And so the idea is if you're in the middle of a game, or say just in the emulation station menu, you're navigating through the games and you decide you're done and you don't want to play anymore, you can just close it, it'll go into sleep. And you can also open it up and it'll wake it back up. And so that's a pretty neat function. Also, if you want to just wake it up without opening it up, you can always just tap on the power button. That's going to wake it from sleep. This will be great if you want to watch 4x3 movies or maybe just play a touchscreen game. Now, speaking of using this thing in like a touchscreen sort of environment like this, one thing you may already have noticed is that the screen is off center. The bezel down here is bigger than up on top. And it's really apparent when you hold the device on its side. You see how it's kind of off center like that? So if you wanted to play a vertical game, something like Temple Run, this can be a little bit awkward. And so if you do plan on using this to play games like this, it's a little bit weird, just the way that it is. But really it's going to be up to, you and what you find to be tolerable. But I do find this to be a little bit awkward in the fact that it is not centered. Now, it is pretty cool. The gyro and everything else works on this. So you can play games like this, but I'm not sure how often you would want to do that. And another thing to think about is that as I'm playing, I don't really see the bezels. I'm just kind of looking at the game itself. So something to think about there. Now let's talk about these controls. And first thing, they are relatively flush. You can see that you can just slide this up and down without ever affecting these controls. In fact, Anbernic, I think, is going to be providing joystick caps with their devices. I didn't get one with mine, but it still actually can close even with the caps that they provide. So something to think about there is that, yes, these are very flush controls. But the thing is, with a lot of these handhelds that either are sliding or have a clamshell, generally they will have really low travel buttons, so that way they're easier to clear. But the interesting thing about the RG Slide is that they did not compromise on the controls. These are exactly the same as you would find on other devices from this company. Here is the RG35XX Pro. They released this one last week and I did a video about it. And this one has identical controls in terms of the D-pad as well as the face buttons. You can see they are exactly the same. So this is a rare clamshell or slide handheld that actually has full-on rubber membrane buttons. It feels exactly like any other Anbernic device. Now, they are very inset right here just to make room for them, but still, it feels very comfortable to use them and very familiar. The D-pad is that same classic, Super Nintendo style, and it feels very good. It's got that same tight kind of Anbernic feel to it, but has good pivot and good travel as well. It also behaves exactly like an Anbernic D-pad. For example, here it passes my contra test really easily. When I rock it left and right, the character barely moves until I really push it one side or the other. So for me, this is ideal and it absolutely passes the contra test. Same thing with my standard Street Fighter test, it's Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. So again, no surprises here. This D-pad behaves exactly like I would expect from Anbernic. Now let's talk about the analog sticks. So these are capacitive joysticks and they feel very good. They have a nice smooth roundness to them. They are relatively small, but I find that to be pretty fitting with a handheld this size. These are the same sticks that were used on the RG557, a much larger device, and those felt really small on that handheld. These ones are very fitting for me. They are quite a bit inset into the handheld, even lower than the D-pad. So something to be mindful of is that you kind of push down to reach them, but I still think it's pretty comfortable. And when it comes to the joysticks themselves, they feel great. They've got a full range of motion. I can go anywhere I need to here, no cardinal snappings, and we've got a full range. So yeah, I really like the feel of these joysticks. They're a little bit small, but again, I think it's pretty fitting on a device like this. And they do click down L3 and R3, so that's nice to see as well. The start and select buttons are a little bit clicky, but easy to press down on. And then finally, we have these face buttons. And like I mentioned before, they have a rubber membrane connection to them, so they feel very nice. And like with other Anbernic devices, the buttons here are glossy. So overall, just a very familiar feeling. Okay, now let's talk about my experience in using this device over the past few hours in terms of ergonomics, because I think this is kind of interesting. So first thing I already mentioned is that it feels top heavy. So as you're balancing it here with the index fingers, which are actually pretty high up on the device, it still feels like the majority of the weight is right here as opposed to everything below your index fingers. So even as you're holding the index fingers here to kind of prop it up and then you're playing your game, it still feels like it could fall over like that a little bit, like it's just a little bit tipsy. So it doesn't feel like a super balanced handheld just because the top has so much weight to it. Now when it comes to playing your bread and butter games, those with D-pad and face buttons, this is a little bit awkward just because the thumbs are kind of far down on the handheld, and so it just has a little bit less leverage. I feel like naturally I would want to hold the device like this, where it's kind of cupped in my palms, and then I would have my controls right around here. But as you can see, that is not that case. This is actually quite a bit farther down. And so I suspect that this is going to be a long-term problem when I go and play this over the next week before I make my review, in that this is a little bit awkward to hold. It's top heavy, and then also these controls are really far down on the bottom. And this is a similar complaint to what I've heard about the PSP GO. It looks really awesome, the ability to be able to close this up and then open it up and be able to play on the fly. But, it also comes with a consequence, and that is that the controls are not super ideal. Now, surprisingly, single analog stick games, like Dreamcast here, is actually a little bit more comfortable. And I think that's because, the thumb is a little bit more inboard, which makes my hand shift inside as well. And so I feel like I have a little bit more leverage when using an analog stick like this. My left hand seems to be cupping the device a little bit more than when using the D-pad. So I actually like this setup a little bit more than using the D-pad, which is kind of surprising. And so when it comes to a game like Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, I think I would prefer to use an analog stick over the D-pad just because it gives me a little bit more leverage. And like I said, the analog sticks are just fine on this. And so I would probably play the game like this. Now, when it comes to twin stick games, something like Time Splitters 2, this actually feels surprisingly comfortable as well. It's a bit of a reach to actually reach the trigger buttons just because the distance between the thumbs and the triggers. But overall, I would say this is still actually pretty good. I could play games like this. I don't think it would be my first choice, but in general, yeah, I could see myself playing like this. And it's a little bit crazy that for Anbernic, a company who, often makes very D-pad centric handhelds, the analog stick experience is better than the D-pad experience for me, at least in my first few hours with this handheld. And so this is going to take a little bit more testing, but yeah, I'm surprised with the results here. And so when it comes down to it, the ergonomics on this are a little bit weird. It's kind of top heavy. Even as I'm holding it right now, I can feel like it wants to spill forward as opposed to falling back, which is really just a unique feeling when it comes to playing one of these devices. So I definitely need more time on this, another week or so, to really get a good assessment of whether or not for long-term use this is going to be fine. Sometimes you have to adapt to the device. Right now, this is something that feels a little bit strange. I almost feel like I would want just a really small 3D printed grip right here to extend this on the bottom bottom a little bit more to give it a little bit additional weight, and then also give my hand something to hold on to when I'm using it with a D-pad and face buttons. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the screen at this point. Now, this is a brand new screen. We haven't seen it before, but I do want to compare it against a couple others just to get an idea at how it fares. Let's start by comparing 4x3 screens. So this is the RG406H. This one is 4 inches and has a resolution of 960 by 720. So lower resolution and also smaller. The color balance is also quite a bit different. I feel like this one is a lot more skewed towards like a warmer and more yellow color balance, and then also a bit green in terms of tint, whereas this one is a little more on the red side in terms of tint and also has a cooler profile. However, I will note that in terms of just overall vibrancy and richness, I feel like this panel is a little bit washed out in terms of coloring compared to other panels like this one here. Now, comparing it to the OLED panel on the Retroid Pocket 5, you can see that yes, the color differences is quite striking. This one is a lot more rich and vibrant, even though they are at about the same brightness level. I've always considered the Retroid Pocket 5 to have an excellent color balance, and you can see here that the RG Slide is a little bit more cool. Now, there may be variation in panels in terms of color temperature, so this is not a deal breaker for me at all, and definitely not something I even noticed until I had them side by side. And so I think my big takeaway here is that this is a good panel. It's very impressive in terms of its overall size, but the colors are not as vibrant as I was expecting, even for an LCD panel. It's a little bit washed out. Now let's talk about brightness and dimness. We'll compare it against the RG406H. So this one is about at like 60% brightness, whereas this one is about 50. Now if we put them up to 100%, you can see the slide gets a lot brighter. See how much more it's washed out with my camera compared to this one. So that's a good sign. It's not a super bright screen, but it is good enough to be able to play outdoors. So here I am in mid-afternoon, and you can see both in shade as well as in direct sunlight. This I would consider to be playable. I would much rather play it in the shade, but I think you could get by if you did play this in direct sunlight. So yeah, I think this is a pretty good balance here. Now going down to 0%, even with my studio lights off, these are both very dim displays, and I would say again that the RG Slide is a little bit better in that regard because it is a little bit dimmer. So this will be a good handheld to be able to play in the dark. So the screen quality I think is pretty good. It gets quite bright and also quite dim. The colors are a little bit on the cool side, and also it's not quite as saturated as some of the screens I've seen at this price point, but I think it's going to get the job done. One other thing worth noting is that the screen does have a black border or bezel around it. So even though it is very faint, you can definitely see it here. I kind of wish that it was a little bit shorter, and so it just kind of blended directly into the shell. But yes, you can see that black rim around everything. If this does bother you, they are going to be offering a black colorway, and so that might be a better fit just because you won't be seeing that border quite as much. Same thing with the off-center panel. I think on the black model, it won't be that easily visible. So if those two things bother you, then the black model might be the way to go. Now the big draw about this screen is that it's now the biggest 4x3 display that we've seen in a retro handheld. Usually they cap out at around 4 inches. In addition, it's also the highest resolution 4x3 display that we've seen. 1280 by 960 is what the original Retroid Pocket Mini was supposed to be, but it was not. And so this now actually as 4x3 is a true 1280 by 960. And this is definitely going to have some implications when playing 4x3 systems. Now, this product is still under embargo. I'm not supposed to show any sort of like game performance or frame rates or anything else like that until the device actually launches on the 20th. So in this video, I'm just going to show you how some things will look. So here I am running an NES game, and there's a few things going on here that I want to make note of. Number one is this is a perfect 4x3. So I've got this scaling set to just basically make it full screen, which I think looks awesome. Now this screen is not a perfect integer scale with NES. For example, if we turn it on, you can see that it actually adds some black borders. So it's not a perfect integer scale, but there are ways to work around that. And one of the easy fixes for this when you're using non-integer scaling but you want a balanced picture is to use an interpolation shader. I've done a whole shaders guide. I'll leave it linked down below if you don't know what I'm talking about. But today we're going to use one called Pixel AA. So even though this is not integer scaling, it still has balanced pixels, and that's what I would prefer to use on a system like NES. Now the other thing that I have going on here is I'm using what they call black frame insertion because this is a 120 Hz panel. If we go into the Android display settings, we have the ability to adjust the screen refresh rate. There's auto, this will be on by default. Then you have 60 Hz, 90 Hz, and 120. So what I've been doing is just forcing it to 120 Hz, which just gives me a more consistent frame rate. This obviously is going to drain the battery faster, but I think it's well worth it. From there, if you go into the RetroArch video synchronization settings, there's an option to turn on black frame insertion. What this means is that for 60 Hz games, like your typical retro games, it's going to insert a black frame in between every frame, which gives you really good motion clarity. There are other tricks you can do in RetroArch as well, including one called shader subframes. I'm going to have to mess around with this a little bit more in the final review. For now, we're just going to be checking out black frame insertion, but there are multiple options you can do to increase motion clarity while you're playing with a 120 Hz screen with retro games. Now, the thing about black frame insertion is that it will darken the screen. If you imagine, there's a black frame happening in between every other regular frame, which is just going to darken everything. So when you're playing a retro game, you kind of have to boost the overall brightness quite a bit. So here I'm playing it at about 80% brightness to get it where I want it to be, and that's going to drain the battery even faster. And I'm only filming in 30 frames per second, so you're not going to see how nice this looks, but for me, when playing a platformer game like this, it's amazing. You don't see any of that blurring that often will happen when playing a game. It kind of feels like playing on a CRT television. I'm going to spend a lot more time messing around with this screen and these effects, and I'll put that in my final review, but I did want to mention that yes, black frame insertion is working just great. But one other potential drawback of using this feature is that it will make it a little bit harder to play outdoors as well. So you may not want to play retro games like this with black frame insertion on if you're playing outdoors. It can also be a little bit annoying to jump in and out of your retro games because the brightness is going to go way up when you get outside of RetroArch. So if I close out of the game here and it takes me back to the regular screen, you can see that, man, it's just like super bright. So I often have found myself having to go in and readjust the brightness settings when I'm going in and out of those retro games within RetroArch. But those nitpicks aside, this is still an excellent experience when it comes to retro gaming. The fact that this is 4.7 inches is very large with a 4:3 aspect ratio. And then when you combine that with like the Pixel AA shader, which balances out all the pixels, even when using non-integer scaling, you can see that everything here in the Mega Man Life bar is perfectly balanced. And so it's a really nice visual experience. When you combine that with a black frame insertion to give you awesome motion clarity, this can be a really good experience for playing these older games. So I definitely hope that Anbernic continues to use this screen in other handhelds going forward, because I think that it's probably one of the best 4:3 experiences that you can have on a retro handheld. And because we have a 1280 by 960 resolution, that means that we will have a perfect 2x scale when it comes to systems that are 480p, like Dreamcast, and that's going to scale great for things like Nintendo 64 and also PlayStation 1. So all those systems are going to look pretty awesome on this display because they're just going to naturally scale correctly. And when you run these games via RetroArch, you can also use black frame insertion, so it's a really cool experience. Now, the higher-end 4:3 systems, GameCube and PS2, can also run on this system pretty well. Now, performance metrics are still under embargo. That's going to wait for the final review, but I have tested this chipset, the T820, on multiple other handhelds. So if you are curious about how it's going to perform, I would recommend checking out those other videos here on this channel. My main takeaway here is that this screen is going to fit these systems really well, and it's pretty great playing things like GameCube and PS2 on a 4.7-inch display that is natively 4:3. It feels very fitting. Now, because the RG Slide is shaped like a PSP GO, you might think to yourself, well, how does it play when it comes to PSP games? And performance-wise, it's fine. You can play these to match the resolution on the display, and we've got enough juice for that. It really comes down to the aspect ratio because the PSP was originally a 16:9 system. And so you can see right here that we do have black bars at the top and bottom. Now, the actual image is larger than on the PSP GO, but this is also a much larger handheld. So it's really going to be up to you and what you actually can tolerate in terms of the black bars and whatnot. But I would say it's not a perfect experience when it comes to PSP, but still all the games are going to play just fine. Now, comparing the size between a native 16:9, like, the Retroid Pocket 5, then yes, there is a big difference between the two. I mean, this one is 5.5 inches, whereas this is not quite there. It looks like 16:9 content is about 4.3 inches here on the RG Slide, which is actually larger than the original PSP. So even though it does look a little bit smaller and squished because of these black bars, this is a bigger viewing experience than the original PSP. It just doesn't really compare with the 5.5 inches that we have on the Retroid Pocket 5. So it will come down to what you plan on playing. If you want an exclusive PSP machine, then there's probably going to be better options out there. I would say maybe the Retroid Pocket Flip 2 with its clamshell design and 16:9 screen might be a better fit just because it's about the same size as the RG Slide, but you're going to have a much bigger PSP viewing experience with an OLED display. Now let's also do a quick test of the audio here. So I'm playing Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge at 100% volume. It gets very loud, and also I like these stereo speakers. They have nice stereo differentiation. So I do think the audio here is pretty good, and I like the fact that it's front facing, so it's going right into your face as you're playing. It's a very immersive experience, so I like the audio on this device. And then finally, let's just briefly touch on the software experience in general. Now, this is an Android-based handheld, which means that, the setup for this is going to be like any other tablet or phone or Android-based device. You just download your apps, you install all the emulation features you want, you sync them up with your games, and then from there, you basically just use a front end like Emulation Station Desktop Edition, or even the built-in one from Anbernic. But after that, yeah, it's a pretty easy experience to be able to jump in and out of your games. And I've really enjoyed, after I turned on the sleep settings with the slide, to be able to slide this closed in the middle of a game, slide it back open, and get right back into it. That's been a really fun experience. Now, if you want to get further into the weeds in terms of settings, you can drop down from the top menu here. There are some options. For example, we can turn on the performance mode. You can see I have it set here to high mode. That is going to be the performance mode on these devices. And then also you can adjust the fan settings here. So you can have like a really high fan or a low one. I have it just set into the medium here, and that's worked out pretty well for me so far. You can also adjust the way the button layout is, and so I like to have mine on the Xbox mode. One thing worth noting is that when you reset the device with this particular device, it will toggle back to Nintendo Switch mode, which is an annoying thing that used to happen with the other devices with this chipset. It was fixed with the RG557, but it looks like they've reverted, or at least haven't fixed it here on this device. One other thing worth noting, if you go into the settings menu and you go down to the bottom, there's an option here, handheld game console settings. This is brand new. I've never seen this with an Anbernic device, but we have some options within here to make some adjustments. There's not a lot you can configure just yet, but that slide setting that I showed earlier, that's where you can find it. You've got a couple other things like being able to test your joysticks, and then you can also do things like check your keys as well to make sure that all the buttons are working properly. So none of this is really life-changing, but it is nice to be able to customize your slide settings right here on the device. And then finally, one other thing I wanted to address was a lot of comments I've seen have been like, hey, can I use this thing as my phone? Because it reminds me of like an old Sidekick and I want to get back to the old days. And no, this does not have a SIM card, and I don't expect to see these in Anbernic devices anytime soon. It seems like a really simple fix. You just get a SIM card slot right here. You pop in your card, you'll be able to connect to your local network or whatever you're using for your telephone signal, and then be able to use this thing as a phone. And I get the allure for that. I mean, obviously this thing kind of looks like a phone like this and very old school. But I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is there are a lot of licensing requirements when it comes to actually getting something set up as a phone, and it costs the company a lot of money. That's why cell phones are a lot more expensive than these devices, even when they have the same chipset. It's because of all those costs associated with that setup. If you think about even like the Wi-Fi versus LTE versions of like an iPad or other tablets, the LTE versions are always a lot more expensive. And that's because even that requires additional licensing, and those don't even have data like in terms of voice, it's just data on its own. And so I don't really see this happening with any of these cheaper handhelds in the future, even though it is kind of tempting to have this thing as like your phone and gaming machine in one. So let's wrap up and summarize my first impressions with the RG Slide. Now, it's way too early to make a full likes and dislikes column, but I can at least get some early impressions. I'm going to call this delights and concerns. And I think there's a lot of good things here. Number one is this is a pretty cool mechanism. I think a lot of people have nostalgia for these slide type handhelds and phones because they are super fun. It's such a small thing, but I've really enjoyed the idea of just sliding this up, grabbing my controls, and just playing like that. Now, obviously, it's a gimmick. There are devices that play just fine without this slide mechanism, but it's still a lot of fun to play with. I also think we have a great screen here. I love the high resolution, the fact that it's 4.7 inches and a true 4:3. I wish the colors were a little bit more vibrant, but other than that, I've had no complaints. One of my favorite things about the screen is that it has a 120 Hz refresh rate, which opens up a lot of options. We talked a bit about black frame insertion, but I've got a couple other scaling things I want to try with this screen, so we'll be on the lookout for that in my final review. I also like the fact that even though it's a slide-out handheld, it has the same familiar controls that we know from Anbernic, and so the D-pad, the face buttons, the analog sticks, all these work really well. And then in general, I just like the fact that Anbernic is trying something new. I mean, they are known for making the same device over and over again, and so anytime they come up with a new idea, I think it's worth celebrating. Now, even though it's only my first day with this handheld, I do have a few concerns, and number one is the fact that this is surprisingly large. A lot of this probably has to do with the fact that devices like the Xperia Play and the PSP GO were a lot smaller than the RG Slide, and I think people's expectations are that this is going to be an easily pocketable device, and I'm here to say that I don't really think it is. It's also surprisingly heavy. I think it's probably the heaviest handheld of this size. The ergonomics are also something I'm a bit concerned about because just in my first day, it feels a little bit uncomfortable in certain situations. So I'm going to give it another week and just test it very thoroughly, but yeah, I don't have really high hopes that this is going to be a perfectly ergonomic machine. And then another big concern and unknown is that I don't know how much this is going to cost. Obviously, by the time I make my review, I will, but I surely hope this is going to be priced similarly to the other devices with the T820 chipset, which are around $150 and $160. If the price point on this gets close to or even exceeds $200, it's just going to make it harder and harder to recommend. Now, thankfully, many Anbernic devices do go on sale eventually, but I think that around $150, $160 would be a really nice sweet spot. But at the same time, I could see Anbernic saying that, they spent all this money on this brand new screen, which was custom developed for them, and they want to get some of that money back. And so I could see this thing going for like $180, even $200. And at that point, that becomes a bigger investment and it's harder to make a purchase for. So putting this all together, I've got kind of two key takeaways with the RG Slide. The first is that when I look at this thing, my eyes and my heart say yes. Like I love this big screen. I love the fact that it has this really kind of neat gimmick to it. And so, yes, my heart and eyes say yes, but my hands kind of say no, because this is kind of blocky and large and heavy, and the ergonomics are not on point, at least right now. And so I'm going to take a little bit more time to adjust to it, but as it stands right now, there are some compromises here, and you have to figure out, okay, what is going to lean me towards one way or the other? Like, is the screen and the overall just gimmick of this so good that I can overlook these control options? It's similar with like a clamshell handheld, which has a lot of good benefits for it, but then also is not quite as ergonomic. And so I see the same thing happening here. My other big takeaway is that it feels kind of like a Generation 1 product. It feels kind of thick and heavy and bulbous. And part of me thinks that, like with other electronics, when they make a Generation 2, it's going to be a little bit more compact and smaller and maybe a little bit more streamlined. And so this one feels like it's the first attempt to it. And whether or not that's going to be enough for you and whether or not you want to be an early adopter, so to speak, when it comes to a slide-based device, that's all going to be up to you. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around this product, but just as a dash of like cold water here too, is that, I don't find it to be a perfect handheld right out of the box. So I kind of feel like I've only scratched the surface of the RG Slide. Because it's a new form factor, I just need a little bit more time to kind of let it cook in my brain and see whether or not this is going to be a good purchase for everybody else. As it stands right now, I can see some really good high points, but a couple low points as well. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Have you been looking forward to a form factor like this? And is the RG Slide like your device of 2025? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. We will see you next time. Happy gaming.